right, so we truly live in unprecedented times. I hope everyone remembers that word unprecedented, because I thought 2 years ago I wouldn't hear it for about another 100 years. But lo and behold, a couple of years later, again, we find ourselves in unprecedented times. So in terms of what's happening globally, historians are saying that they're dubbing it the US war with Iran, is basically creating an energy system shock 3 to 4 times larger than anything that has ever happened in history before. And the head of the International Energy Agency has basically described it as the volumes of energy caught up are more than both oil shocks in the 1970s and the gas that was shorted from the system when Russia invaded Ukraine. So where to from here? We're kind of sitting at this point where you kind of go, well, are we going to go down the world where the US finds themselves in an escalation trap and they can't get out of the war? Or are we going to have, Trump Taco Tuesdays, where he just backs out and capitulates totally? Nobody knows, but what is clear is that explaining the energy transition now has become far more complicated. And basically, you have to somehow straddle the point where you're explaining the energy transition sits somewhere between a Mad Max world dystopian future and potentially a utopian future where an all-electric future where everything's beautiful and green. But we're going to be going somewhere in between now, and it's far more difficult to actually explain what's going to happen and how you have to position portfolios, systems, and the overall energy transition. So before I jump into the presentation, I will be talking about the economic impacts of the war and supply system shocks, but it's important to acknowledge that there is a war, or wars going on, and people are dying, and basically you've also got large-scale people displacement across multiple regions, as well as huge food security risks that will be becoming more and more paramount. I was hearing numbers in the hundreds of millions if this goes on for a prolonged period of time, because it's not just gas and oil, it's also fertiliser. So today's presentation, I'll basically be taking you through how to prepare for system shocks and the importance of front-loading optimal capacity into the system to ensure resilience and returns. Now, unfortunately, we're going to be covering a lot of material today because of the current conflict that's continuing. I wanted to pack in a lot more and give you a bit more of a wholesome understanding of how to use Plexos to really come and answer some of these questions. But I'll be starting off by giving a brief overview as to why stress testing, which is looking at individual threats, and wargaming, which is a combination of threats, is essential in an era of data center-driven demand surges and global geopolitical supply shocks. Section 1 of the presentation will be covering what you kind of need as in modern energy market modelling methodologies and tools, and basically why stress testing and wargaming is an essential part of it. Section 2 is basically going to look at why strategic overbuilding of capacity above least cost models provides insurance against high price events at a minimal cost to consumers. And thirdly, I'll be highlighting the importance of co-optimised electricity and gas market models, as gas supply for GPG is becoming more and more critical to ensuring that coal can actually exit the system. So jumping straight into it, this is going back to 101 basics, but it's important for the build-up. So basically, Plexos uses a staged modelling approach, with each stage answering a different set of questions. In the LT schedule, you're basically getting the optimum system build, subject to your input assumptions and the constraints that you put in the model. Now, in the LT schedule, you do get a price, but you can't use that at all because it has insufficient volatility, and I'll be covering that in the later sections. This then cascades down and feeds the MT and the ST schedule, where you can overlay market bidding behaviour, put in some ramp rates and unit commitments, and try and get more of a market simulation through which you get a more holistic effect on price and also emissions. But there's one kind of key stage that's missing in this cascading approach, and that's on the far right here, which is stress testing and wargaming. Now, this should be the summary slide that I should come to the end of my presentation, but I've got it up front, so apologies. But basically, stress testing and wargaming really helps you understand the reliability and the total costs for the system that you're trying to ascertain through Plexos market modelling. And that's basically because, and I'll be going through this in more detail, but least cost modelling basically builds you the minimum viable product. But as soon as you start trying to shake it, you put in different weather reference years, you run a few shocks through the system, you start seeing that lots of unserved energy can come out if something slightly different eventuates. It's the bare minimum build profile. So it doesn't really give you what you need in terms of reliability. And similarly, in terms of costs, if you do only steady state modelling, you're only going to be getting reasonable price outcomes. But we know that's not how markets work. They are constantly shocked, and you see these volatility flowing through. So again, this is why it's so important to do so. So I'm going to take a break and go back in time here to 2 years ago when I was at the conference. I did do a detailed methodology on stress testing in wargaming, and I don't want to necessarily redo all of it, but just to go to basically the highlights and what you need to do at a bare minimum. So a threat assessment is where you take individual variables. So that could be weather reference years, gas supply shocks, increasing demands, and you put it through your model. And what you get is a certain amount of unserved energy that comes out. You also get a fully firm capacity gap that sits there, and you can look at the price impacts. Now, you can look at each of these separately. It's really important to do that separately. Then wargaming is where you start combining them. So for example, you could be in a scenario where you have increasing demand due to data centers, and you have gas supply shocks, like we find ourselves in at the moment. And that could be a wargaming scenario. And from that, you get a lot more unserved energy coming through the system, and you get a very large firm capacity gap. Now, using that information, you can then go back into your Plexos models and go, well, what's the least cost solution to this very bad scenario that I find myself in? And it basically tells you what's the optimal least cost capacity that you need to build to front load or get through some of these, basically wargaming scenarios. And what's really important to highlight here is that these wargaming scenarios always go after, if you've banned gas from the system, they go after storage duration. They never go after short duration batteries. I saw a title from your new economy, which is batteries are the answer to everything. And I go, yes, insofar as you can make them unlimited in duration. Duration is always key because least cost models are always solving for the worst time in the year. So if you look in the middle of winter for 2 weeks, it's basically trying to solve for when the system is short that VRE. And that's why it goes after duration, always goes for gas first. If you don't have a limited gas and you've got constraints there, it then goes to long duration. So that's also quite important. And you can kind of look at how the threat assessment affects, A, your price, and you can look at, for example, on the far right here, you had the bad scenario where you had prices going to infinity and beyond. And if you put the build back that Plexos says is an optimal pathway, you can see that you get prices in the realm of sanity, as in the market's actually still solving. So that's a 2-minute summary of threats, threat assessment and wargaming methodology. But it's important to have that in mind as we start moving through other more complicated topics, which you basically need that background for. All right, so bills. In the NEM, we're basically moving in Australia towards something called ESIM, where we're looking to charge consumers for any new capacity coming into the system. So if you are a decision maker or you're trying to feed information up the line, you need to show how much it costs consumers. I mean, cash is king, it's always been the way. So instead of talking about transmission in arbitrary, oh, here's $5 billion, or I need to open up this res at $10 billion, you need to say, this transmission is going to cost $5 billion. If I put it on a bill, it only costs $15, but we expect it to save $20 in normal steady state operations. But if there's a supply shock or something goes wrong, we expect consumers to be able to save $50 in that year. Everything needs to be translated back to a bill, and you can do that quite easily. There's a bit of work in there, but if you put in the time and effort, I think it's basically one person at 3 months to 6 months. You can basically have all your outputs coming through, being post-processed, and you can just do bill impacts. And where Plexos helps you answer those questions is around transmission, wholesale costs, and investment subsidies for the new generation that come through. Now, there's probably a little bit of a nuance here that if you do least cost capacity expansion modelling properly, you should never need an investment subsidy. But that's a rabbit hole we don't need to necessarily get through. But if you're forcing in policies or doing things that lead to suboptimal outcomes, you will need a requirement for a subsidy that does sit in there. All right, now, why steady state modelling can't give you the answers? So if you see here on the left, that's basically a normal bill. And if you're talking about something's going to happen, you can say it's a 10, 20% increase. But if you actually look at a bill shock, like we had in 2022, that's a 100% increase for consumers in one individual year. And so where it becomes critical for stress testing and wargaming is when you go create these future steady states, you also need to consider what's happening on the right here, which is a massive supply shock or something blowing up or something going wrong, because in fact, that's the reality of what happens. And before jumping into this next slide, I think I want to spend a moment here on the monthly NEM wholesale price. So I do love this chart a lot because if you speak to any of the old timers in the industry, they'll tell you that times were really tough back in the millennial drought and they had it, and they lost lots of money or made lots of money. But what I like to look at this graph, it's kind of like housing crisis and talking to boomers about how hard it was back in the day. Yep, times were tough, but if you fast forward to today, it looks absolutely apocalyptic. And what we're seeing in 2022 is basically price rises which are far exceeding what anyone thought was possible. And now the new the winter price shape, if you take into account and you put it back in time, is far in excess what we would consider, a crisis back in the teens or even in the noughties. So we are really living in unprecedented times. And the other thing to clearly note from this is that you've got in that 2022 crisis, the wholesale costs were basically $20 billion extra for consumers in that year. And if you looked at what was happening around that time, the federal government had released $20 billion to basically build all the transmission in the NEM. Now, transmission was a lot cheaper back then, but imagine if we had actually moved and locked in those transmission components, locked in the converter station and the cabling for $20 billion, not the new price tag, it would have been infinitely cheaper and we would have been in a far stronger position than we are today now, where everything has increased in prices and we haven't built sufficient capacity to provide that insurance against another supply shock. So going back to what I actually wanted to explain with this slide is that AEMO's electricity statement of opportunity, so that is basically published every single year and it looks at unserved energy in the market, does not deal with these types of price or supply shocks. So in April of 2022, it published and said there was not going to be any problems for that year. But it was incredibly difficult. For anyone involved in the market at the time, we barely kept the lights on. And that's basically because the LNG was sucking out all the gas. We had higher coal prices as well. So coal went up 4 to 5 times. It wasn't just gas. And then we had a whole bunch of unplanned coal unit failures. And it was touch and go. It was really just trying to get coal into the power stations, trying to find the molecules. And hydro was basically generating to the point where it couldn't generate anymore and coming up against its physical constraints. And that's basically coming to my next point, that if the ESU and the GSU are saying things are fine today, AEMO does caveat this. It's not there to look at these kinds of crises. And unfortunately, we're in an equally susceptible position today because we still don't, as of today, unless they've announced something, have basically an export cap on gas and basically stopping any of, well, the main one is Santos, sucking the gas out of the system and making prices surge. So there might be a domestic gas reservation policy. It'll be interesting to see how that is built and what it does. But if there's an opportunity to gain, basically what we're seeing is that the current JKM curves are 3 times what the gas spot price is here. So if they pass the legislation and they're happy to try and get as much gas out of the system, you might see that taking place quite quickly. So then the markets will bind and we'll go into another energy crisis. Another kind of key point is that in the NEM, small amounts of unserved energy in the model, and this is probably valid in any jurisdiction, can equate to the market reaching its cumulative price threshold and subsequent suspension. So what's probably worth noting is that in Australia, we have the highest prices for wholesale electricity in the world. So we've got about $20,300 at the top. And if you go look at like Texas, which everyone thought was a bit gung-ho, they had it at 9,000 USD. And I don't know if anyone remembers, but a few years ago, you had a massive outage in Texas over winter. And lo and behold, they went, oh my God, we can't charge the consumer these costs. This is way too much. So they backed off from the $9,000 per megawatt hour USD and they went back down to 5,000. So if you convert that into Australian AUD, our price cap is 3 times that of the US. So in terms of how they're doing free market over there, they look like a bunch of socialists. And we are basically full-blown free marketeers down here, down under. So what does that mean? Well, if you've got small amounts of unserved energy appearing in your model, what we keep seeing is that if that does happen, I'm in meetings, and what really grinds my gears is people go, I don't care about that unserved energy. It's a small amount of blackouts. And I go, I also don't care about the unserved energy. What I care about is the fact that we've basically hit the cumulative price threshold. We've had 8 hours at market cap. And now, lo and behold, wholesale costs for consumers have increased by 20% for the year. So if you're seeing small amounts of unserved energy appear in your model, which can come through when you do stress testing or wargaming, that can indicate there's a lot of volatility that sits there, and you could be in a scenario where you start seeing rapid cost increases in the wholesale market. Similarly, if you're running a private portfolio, why does it become so important? Well, if you take the VIC price duration curve, and for those who are unfamiliar with a price duration curve, you basically take prices and time. So on the y-axis, you've got where it goes to the max, 20,300, and all the way down to negative 1,000, and the top 1% of prices sit on the far left, and on the far right, you have the lowest prices that sit there as well. Now, what ends up happening here is in Australia, if you kind of fall asleep for a few days of the year and you can't manage your position, you can basically lose 3 or 4 years worth of really good trading and really good performance results. And so basically, if you can generate into the top 3.2% of prices in VIC, but it's 3 to 4% anywhere within the NEM, that's more valuable than generating to the bottom 70% of prices. So again, stress testing, wargaming, seeing what's coming through the system. If you can see that there's any of those potential spikes there, it's just really important to get yourself prepared. And probably lastly, this is my most depressing slide. And there's been a few already to date. So I don't know if anyone remembers, there used to be someone called Donald Rumsfeld, and during the first Iraq invasion, he would always stand up on stage and explain known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns as explanations to what was going wrong, and kind of washing away how they did a good job and they couldn't have possibly foreseen it. What I find really depressing is that data center demand growth and the Straits of Hormuz closing are known knowns. Like, this should have been on everyone's scenario and planning and stress testing and wargaming kind of spreadsheet. We had it there, and when we both modeled them separately, we went, oh my gosh, this is impossible. We hope either of these events don't happen, because that would be absolutely catastrophic to the system. And lo and behold, we find ourselves a few years later in a potential scenario where both could unfold. Now, with the Straits of Hormuz closing as well, the question is how much damage happens to the infrastructure. If it was to open today, yep, the forward market has got forward curves going high for the next year. But if there's extensive damage, we're talking potentially 4 to 5 years of tail-end economic consequences globally, which would be absolutely catastrophic. So in terms of how you view the market, putting these two together, it can be incredibly destructive. And it would be great to come back in 5 to 10 years' time to actually figure out, what are the known unknowns or the unknown knowns or the unknown unknowns that actually come through and affect the energy transition as well. All right, so moving on to the next topic, why strategic overbuilding of capacity above what least cost capacity expansion models give you provides insurance against high price events at minimal cost to consumers. So this is a very matter-heavy slide, so I apologise, but I've left it in there if anyone wants to go through the details and pick apart and recreate something for themselves. But the concept is quite simple. If you bring forward storage in VRE, that lowers wholesale prices for consumers by removing fossil fuels as a marginal price setter. So during the 2022 crisis, I'm using, this is my favourite chart from AEMO, by the way, from the QED report. They release this quarterly. I'm going back to 2022 because in a crisis, hydro and gas play more of a role in terms of setting the price. But you can see there in the red box there that hydro and gas is basically setting the price, I don't know, somewhere between 60, 70% of the time, and coal was the remaining 20%. And so what happens there is in that crisis, hydro shadow bids gas. And the reason why hydro has to shadow bid gas is because if they undercut gas too much, they'll generate too hard and they'll run out of water. But if they price too high, they're not going to get any of their generation away. So for them, it's an opportunity cost, and that's why they've really got to shadow bid that gas and square away their generation. So if hydro controls the price and gas controls and hydro follows gas, basically the relationship you can see historically is a $1 per gigajoule gas price rise leads to about a $10 per megawatt hour cost increase in the elect markets. And so on the right here, you can see the relationship between the New South Wales gas and electricity price that sits there. And so it's not surprising if you try and get in more VRE and more batteries in the top of that section of the marginal price setting, you can try and decouple ourselves from fossil fuels and potentially from international shocks as well. It's also important to note here as well that if they do solve the gas cap, that doesn't fully solve our problem. So let's just say we've got some kind of export controls and gas prices don't go too crazy. In the worst case scenario, if we're talking like 100 billion cubic metres of gas being destroyed and there's only 600 globally, what will happen is coal substitution globally, just like in 2022, and you're likely to see coal prices again go through the roof at potentially 4 to 5 times, and that will likely lead to coal also having to be more aggressive and go in harder. And so it could be in this weird world where if you don't fix the coal problem but you fix the gas problem, you could end up having to run gas harder and it might go back into disequilibrium, and you could end up in a supply shock as well. So it's worth noting that there's 2 commodities here that can do this, but gas is the key one. All right, so starting with least cost model builds, going back to the bill, you can basically start mapping through what are some of the solutions that you can do to basically ensure consumers from paying too much for this energy transition. So if you start off with a historical benchmark, you can go to a new base case scenario and you can run a sensitivity going, well, what happens if we get a bit more affordable gas into the system? You can reduce bills. What happens if we front load wind and we do it not in an optimal manner, but that requires subsidies? Again, you can lower bills and consumers can actually afford to pay for that front load of wind. You can also look at basically trying to reduce the cost of wind, and you can also do stuff like looking at concessional financing for transmission. Now, all of these are incredibly important given that the cost of the energy transition is going to be higher than what it was, say, a month ago, because remember what happened in 2022? Transmission costs went from, I'm going to get this wrong, but like WRL and VNI West used to be, I don't know, 2 to 3 billion together. And now we're looking at combined total costs of 12. God help us what it's going to cost again when the rest of the world panics and tries to buy as much converter stations, as much cable as they can. We're going to go into a supply-constrained world for even generation. And lastly, going back to consumer bills and impacts, the key thing with stress testing in wargaming is you can see the benefits of front-loading capacity. It's not that shocking that if you put more wind into your system, you can reduce the costs of any of these shocks that happen to your system as well. So a gas shock happens, but you front-loaded wind, consumers have got a bit of insurance protection there as well. All right, importance of co-optimised gas and electricity market models. As gas supply for GPG is critical to ensuring that coal can exit the system. Now, this is becoming more timely given that there's, and this is going to be different for each country because some countries might not transition from coal to GPG anymore, because if they were requiring that from LNG, they might just go straight to a solution without it now. So this is going to be different for each nation, but for us in Australia, assuming that we are one of the world's largest gas exporters and we can sort ourselves out, it's not surprising that you really need to take what comes out of your electricity market modelling and basically go, if GPG is going through the roof post-coal closure, do I have the corresponding gas supply? If the answer is no or yes, doesn't matter. You need to feed that into a gas model and figure out, well, do you actually have the molecules at the right place at the right time? Now, AEMO does a fantastic job and gives us a market model that we can change and look at, and they implemented a gas fuel limit for GPG in the southern states. So that's basically everywhere in Australia excluding Queensland. And you can see that it goes up and it goes all the way down during winter, because in winter there's a lot more residents consuming a lot more gas, but in summer there's less gas consumption for heating, so there's more room for GPG. Now, unfortunately, the southern states are running out of gas. There's going to be less gas going forward. We basically have these huge fields that are drying up, which hopefully going to try and find some more. But if not, we're on a downward trajectory. Now, in the model, if you ever go above these constraint, it basically goes, yep, you can violate it, but you just can burn unlimited diesel. But what we're seeing is that if you actually go take what we have in terms of diesel storages across our gas plants, your best case scenario is if you can refill your diesel every 3 days, you're basically only offsetting 150 TJs. So what does modelling look like if you start taking a bit more, not an ISP capacity comes into the system as required, but you take a bit more of a view on capacity coming a bit more slower and coal retirements. Now, this chart here, I'm not meant to show numbers, but I'm trying to show the feel for it. Where you basically start in 2024, you can see the blue lines are well underneath that daily ISP limit. And this is a 3-day moving average. It's not just a daily average. But you can see that in the post-2030s, post-coal retirement, those red lines go up really significantly, which means you need a lot of peak day gas supply feeding into GPG just to ensure that you can get the GPG running as and when required. And you can see that these red lines start appearing sooner rather than later. Now, the new GSU has said we potentially are okay for the winter from July 2028 through to July 2029. But we're basically in a position now where coal stations like Eraring, a genuine question on closure is whether or not there's sufficient gas supply to enable the GPG to run sufficiently. And this is going to become more and more of a problem the closer and closer we get to these types of events. And it's not saying that gas is in the future going to be generating lots and lots. Gas is still going to only be like 5% of the total system mix. But if it can't operate for that 5% of the time, it does not work and you can't close the coal. The other key thing that we're starting to see as well, and we were playing around with, is if you look at kind of your base cases, you get very large differences in your annual gas consumption depending on the weather reference year. So different models tell you different things, but what we're finding when you particularly focus on the weather reference year, the big shock that we're seeing in our models is on GPG consumption. So if you take the grey line, which is like an indicative model feel, and you look at the different weather reference years that AEMO gets, if you use weather reference year 2018 and weather reference year 2017, you can basically see that the annual consumption can differ by almost double in those corresponding years. And from where we start today, you're basically looking at a 3 to 6% fold increase in annual consumption. And that's a lot, given that the current consumption for GPG in the southern states is roughly somewhere between 30 to 50 petajoules a year out of 400. And in these graphs, you can do the math yourself if I'm saying it's a 3 to 6 time. It's a dramatic potential increase. And I'm not saying households should be on gas. I think that should get off, but like as soon as possible and make as much gas potentially available for GPG. But gas is basically the firming fuel of choice for that long duration of period of time. The next best solution is, of course, long duration storage, and we should absolutely be building as much of that as possible. But given the long time horizons and how quickly things are moving, if demand gets away from us, this is going to become more and more of a critical problem for the energy transition. So that's basically, I've covered a lot of topics today, so I do apologise, but I wanted to get through a lot because we really do live in unprecedented times. And I think if you're looking at what you need to do with Plexos, if you're not stress testing and wargaming regularly with your portfolios, whether you're private, regulator, market operator, or elsewhere, it's the essential tool that you need to start implementing or methodology. So thanks. That's my presentation.